We have today a distinguished group of experts from different regions and from different stakeholder segments. We have representatives from government, academia, civil society, and inter-organizational organizations. And I do hope that this round table discussion will do further contribute to the debate on how to expand internet access to the unconnected and how to design effective policy based on data to enable access, in particular for those in remote areas, rural areas, and also to bridge the existing gaps and disparities in many countries in the global south. I would like to introduce our speakers for this session, starting with our colleague, Alison Gilwald. Ms. Gilwald is the Executive Director at RIA, Research ICT Africa, and University of Cape Town. So we have herself representing civil society and academia. Rajan Matthews, Head of COAI, the Cellular Operators Association of India, representing business sector. Professor Hernan Galperin from the University of Southern California. And also, Mr. Galperin is the director at DIRS in Latin America. For those who don't know, is the Diálogo Regional sobre la Sociedad de la Información, representing civil society. We have on my left, Maria Elena Estavillo Flores, commissioner at IFT, the Instituto Federal de Telecomunicaciones, here in Mexico, the regulator, representing government sector. We have also Mr. Mokhtar Yadali, head of the Information Society at Africa Union Commission, representing intergovernmental sector, and Ms. Eleni Gaupaya, CEO at Lirnia Asia, representing civil society. Lirnia Asia, is that correct? Thank you. Well, before I give the floor to our distinguished speakers, let me briefly introduce some relevant and important background ideas to our discussion. First of all, I would like to recall that this debate is very relevant in the context of the UN 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. It is also important to recall that many international organizations such as UN, UNESCO, ITU, and also some initiatives like the Broadband Commission acknowledges that information and communication technologies are cross-cutting enablers of development, in particular universal access to broadband and mobile services. These are crucial for achieving the SDGs and to integrate and even accelerate the progress of the foundations of sustainable development, economic growth, social inclusion, and environmental sustainability. It is also important to mention that the current SDGs framework makes several references to ICTs. I'm not going to list all of them, but just to give you an example, Goal 5 of the SDGs is related to gender equality, that we have just raised this issue in the previous panel. So Goal 5 is to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. And also, let me give another example that is related to ICT. Goal number 9, to build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and foster investment. But those are not the only ones. It's just an example. Of course, the demand side ICT indicators can also help monitor achievement in other areas included in the SDGs, such as poverty reduction, education, economic growth, and inclusive information and knowledge societies. So the demand-side data is very relevant to monitor the attainment of those goals that were agreed internationally, and most of our countries here present are signatory of those goals. Well, in summary, governments need to have reliable data to make informed decisions and to design effective policies, fostering the adoption of ICTs. And I think that there is no doubt that data collection and measurement plays a central role in the Sustainable Development Agenda, as well as in the design of the effective policies. And here goes the questions. Where is the data? And I hope that our speakers will address this question. And now also, I was thinking about what demand-side disaggregated data we have available, especially in the Global South, to understand this challenge that was already posed in the previous session, to really have universal access to broadband. What are the barriers? Affordability is one issue. Sure, it is, but not the only one. Digital literacy, lack of interest. We have, in some countries in Latin America, where we have ICT household surveys, barriers indicator on barriers on the use of internet. And believe it or not, even in countries like Brazil, we have a significant proportion of population that they don't have interest or they don't have the needed skills to use the internet. Are there cultural barriers or gender issues? Well, the answers are likely to be different depending on country, region, income, race, etc. And also, most countries, they have administrative data, supply-side data. Is this enough for policy design? Certainly not, because those data, they are unable to shed light on the demographics, characteristics of users and also non-users. So this is really important. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor to our speakers. We are going to have 90-minute sessions that will be organized like this. Each speaker will have 5 to 7 minutes for their initial remarks. And after this, we will have some time for questions from the audience and also from remote participants. And I would like to initiate our debate, posing some questions. You are free to address one or more of those questions. And the first question that I'd like to pose for our guest speakers are the following. Are the information needs of governments, the technical community, and civil society being appropriately addressed by current research efforts and by data producers for demand-side statistics? What are some good and also possibly bad examples that address these needs from government, from policymakers? What are the key knowledge gaps in demand-side ICT statistics, and how should they be addressed? How can further collaboration be fostered between data producers, meaning academics, multilateral organizations, regulators, among others, and also data users? Are current research methods and standards appropriated? Quantitative surveys, qualitative research? Are there opportunities for further coordination and knowledge sharing? Are existing capacity building efforts adequate to least developed countries? What are the existing funding sources for demand-side ICT statistics? This is very key in this context of producing demand-side data. Are resources being used appropriately? Are there opportunities to improve resource allocation? And finally, how can current research efforts better articulate with explicit targets, such as the ones from United Nations SDGs or the ITU Broadband Commissions? So those are the initial questions that we have thought of to be addressed by our speakers. I would like to give the floor to Alison Gewald to address one or more questions. Alison, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Alessandro. I suppose some of the answers are obvious. I'm going to be speaking from a global South and particularly African perspective. We know that there are enormous data gaps. I mean, even on the supply side that you were speaking about, where you were saying most countries have sufficient administrative data, well, across many of our jurisdictions, we don't even have the administrative data. So on that side, we already have problems. If you look at the importance of this for evidence-based policy, we can just revert to the previous session we were in, where it's not only about whether the data exists or not, and how it's also about how it's being used and which data is preferenced over other data. So you've got very epistemic communities that are working around models and policy formulation that evidence and data is uncritically used above other data that might exist. So, for example, the case was given in Myanmar with the introduction of universal service funds in a context where extensive evidence has existed around the failure of universal service funds and the inability of transitional institutions, particularly in a case like Myanmar, to manage those. And so you have a double negative effect on the poor. Not only do you have the levies pushing up the cost of communications in those environments, but you actually have the funds not administered properly and not given to the poor. And so they, it's a double whammy for the poor. In the face of evidence that has existed, with Learn Asia, extensive evidence that exists on the negative impacts and the failures of universal service funds. So to say, well, they're going to be done, so let's just try and do them better, if actual local evidence was used there, you could have potentially had, I would argue, a far better outcome. So I'm going to sort of, push away that sort of nice, warm, multilateral, or not multilateral, multi-staker approach that, in the last few years, oh, well, if we all work together, we can get this right. What we have a shortage of is actually good, rigorous national statistics. And I'm talking here about, creating public goods in the classical sense, national statistical data as public goods, non-rivalrous, non-excludable goods that all people have access to. So I think this is really important in the context of open data and about government opening its data too, but also industries opening their data. So the administrative data that you were saying is available at local level. In fact, the operators that are providing this data through GSMA and other agencies at these kinds of fora are not providing that data at a local level. So we have very poor supply side data. And then we also, of course, the supply side data can't answer many of the critical questions that we need to answer. So it's particularly in a prepaid mobile environment, you simply cannot get the disaggregated data that on sex disaggregated or income disaggregated or other data, without which you have not got the actual correct points of policy intervention. So at the moment, we're sitting with essentially reinforcing global indices, national indices on imperfect supply-side data, highly imperfect supply-side data, and limited, sometimes highly flawed demand-side data that has really led to a position where, in the absence of demand-side data, we've had very big industry associations, big advocacy groups, on the basis of very, very limited representative data, making national global claims around which policy agendas and development agendas are being formulated. So, I think we need to look at this. If you look at the ITU acknowledges their own problems around delays of time in a prepaid mobile dynamic environment. By the time the data is being received, it's 2 years old, those markets are already changed. And the data that when we speak about this reinforcing data with the ITU, with the World Bank, with WEF, this is all the same data that's recirculated again and again with a different overlay on it. So WEF, it just has a business community overlay, or the World Bank, it's got another. So we really need, nationally representative public in the public domain demand side statistics in order to understand these, especially in this increasingly complex environment that we're in, dynamic and complex environment we're in. So the data that we were seeing around gender, for example, in purely the mobile voice environment, looks completely different once you get into an internet environment where, as we've discussed already, skills and income and that sort of thing. But I just want to make the point here, because I think it wasn't made adequately in the previous session, is that even if you are doing these on a nationally representative scale, which most of the references to gender, etc., are these micro-studies that are not actually claimable at the national level, even if you are doing them at the national level, at the very basic level, out of your household survey or your census, or maybe even a little bit more in-depth ICT access and use survey, if you simply leave it at the level of descriptive statistics, it can actually be misinforming. And I think it really raises the question of, is bad information or misinformation better than no information at all, actually, because it's now directing policy, arguably in indirect interventions. So the demand side data really requires, especially to deal with this complex environment, levels of analysis and modeling that tend not to be available even in national statistics offices. And so I'm really asking for a greater collaboration between, academic communities in many of the countries that are producing very good national statistics on poverty, etc. They're collaborating with their major universities on the actual modeling and analysis of that data. As I said, because the descriptive data can just be entirely misleading. So I think what's important in this environment is to actually track, especially for developing countries, to see what different data is out there. And it's obviously not preferencing one or the other, but understanding the complementary nature of the data and how we can leverage public and private the data is available into a governance framework that makes this data public and open and available for analysis, for further use. And I think this really requires plotting some of the emerging, for example, I know ITU and various other people, Learn Asia is doing a lot of work on this already, but trying to see how big data, for example, can do some of the expensive field work, demand side data that it's very difficult to do instantly as it's able to do, but certainly on an annual basis or something like that, but to use that demand side data in conjunction, obviously, with the supply side data that's improved and better delivered to national regulatory authorities, together with the demand side data. Because although there's lovely public data that goes a long way to answering a number of questions, as I said, it's simply unable to answer critical questions, and many of those critical questions relate to digital inequality, that you actually have to put the money and go into the field and get that data nationally representative so you can model and analyze it properly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison. Indeed, you brought relevant aspects of basing this, making decisions based only on administrative data. And we have, in many countries, those data overestimate penetration. For instance, because they don't consider downing multiple subscription and understanding the real penetration of broadband service, for instance. So this is really very important. And the problem and the issue that I think is funding is a very important issue, to have a regular data collection from the demand side. Well, let's move to Mr. Rajan Matthews. If you could please give us a bit of the perspective of data production in India, demand-side data production from the business sector perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Again, I'm going to speak principally from the commercial aspects, the business aspects. I represent the mobile operators in India. And you're absolutely right. We have statistics which says that we have 1 billion plus connected folks, but that clearly doesn't speak to penetration, and we sometimes confuse the two. If you look at pure households or individuals, you probably are at about 650 million, but still a sizable number. But a very interesting phenomenon happened in India on November the 8th. On November the 8th, the government of India demonetized a certain set of currencies, all right, 500 rupees and 1,000 rupees, and introduced a very interesting dynamic. And the dynamic was that all of a sudden people found that they could not have access to currency with which they needed to conduct their everyday business. what also emerged was the divide in terms of who had access to the money and who didn't. And those who lined up outside of the banks were the folks who did not have access to a digital payment medium. Those folks who had access via a smartphone or even a high-featured phone were able to continue to have their lives go on. And so the people who were lining up were at what we would call the bottom of the pyramid, and it showed principally what happens when government intervenes and does things and shows people what has to happen when they are not involved in a digitized economy. And it was very painful and still painful and is still going on. And I think this is a critical aspect in terms of showing what was the data. One thing that the British taught the Indians very well is to keep statistics. And we've learned that to a fine art. And so there's never a lapse of statistics. But what we find is a plethora of commercial statistics on industry, very little personal statistics, and a lack of integration between the two. And one of the things that the government has done is introduce what we call a national identity, which was part of the reason why we had difficulty tracking personal data, because we had no personal identity. And today, India has embarked and successfully to have 1 billion plus people in what is known as the Aadhaar database, which is a biometric-driven database. At any point in time, any person can, by a thumbprint or retina reading, establish their unique identity. And as a result, more and more people are being brought into the digital economy. So from India, this whole aspect of biometric unique identity is allowing, for the first time, the crossing of this sort of digital divide. So what it does is, because the government is driving a lot of the what we call transfers, be it transfer money for benefits, cooking gas, whatever, the government is forcing people to say, listen, unless you have an online bank account, unless you have an Aadhaar account, unless you have these, we will only do transfers on your electronic media, either bank account, access through a smartphone, access to a... So it's extremely, extremely important from a livelihood perspective to show that this is not just merely a theoretical exercise of crossing the digital divide. And what we're seeing is that the government, because of the government initiatives, is forcing people to begin to start getting, one, digital literacy, and two, getting online in terms of actually being able to do digital interventions, be the bank accounts or any other thing that allows them to enjoy government services. So I think this is one of the things that is happening right now and is also continuing to be the focus in terms of inclusion and in terms of data. Now, one of the things that we talked about is the personalized data. Interestingly, private operators are the ones that have the bulk of the personal data, all right? And it's all there. At any point in time, we know a phenomenal amount of information about every user that is on our network, especially as we migrate to 3G and 4G networks. It's phenomenal. What unfortunately is happening is that we don't know what to do with all this data. Operators are least situated, in fact, to cull the social aspects. We are commercially driven, right? And so we will use this data for upselling and commercial aspects. And so we need to ask ourselves, in this information that's there, how do we cull out the socially beneficial aspects of what is sitting in our databases? There is no government agency today that has the amount of information in the granularity that mobile operators have in countries. So I think this is important. And I think it goes to the issue of static versus dynamic data. I think we have dynamic data, not static data, because we find out on a daily basis what's happening in terms of where people are. And I think I'll close with this. I think one of the things that I often hear is about solutions. One of the things we have to deal with is scalability. Solutions that are one-off don't help us because we don't know how to market it, we don't know how to sell it, and we don't know how to implement it if it's not scalable. The one-offs are good for NGOs and others who will go in and do an intervention and do something, but they never tell us how to scale this up to the 1 billion plus. All right, what's the scale? Because we rely on this. And then finally, is what I believe is risk-taking. In most developing countries, especially in India, the government realizes that they simply don't have the bandwidth to raise the type of finances and to conduct the scope and scale of business that is required to do the penetration. So they've privatized it. But unfortunately, having privatized it, they starved the industry of the needed resources. And this is in spades in India. And so they do not know how to factor in risk-taking into the metrics and into the decision-making of both regulatory and policy making. And so again, from a developing perspective, I'd say that governments, in terms of initiating this divide, need to ask, if you've given it into the hands of the private industry, and if you believe that they are going to be the engines, not to say that we ignore the government sector, but risk-taking and return on investment are important criteria in the equation that determines how digital divide is going to be addressed. And this is one of the issues we face in India, in this conundrum that we have between profit is bad, but we want penetration. We want to connect the next 1 billion. Let's get the billions of dollars that are necessary for investment, ignoring what is an appropriate rate of investment to private operators. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajan. And I think that what you have just said reinforces what Alison has said about the need of collaboration between government, academia, other stakeholders, in order to address the challenge that countries like India, Brazil, and many countries in Asia and Latin America and in Africa faces in order to have universal access. And also, it is very interesting what you said about commercial and industry data provided by industry, because usually it lacks academic, methodological rigor, and they are biased. So how come policymakers gonna take informed decision based on the industry or industry association data? So this is very important, and this collaboration definitely helps in-depth analysis of this data. Well, let's move to Professor Hernan Galperin. If you could address one of those questions, and you are a deep knowledge of the situation of broadband in Latin America and the challenge that we face in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandre. The challenge we face in Latin America clearly is on the demand side. There's about 200 million Latin Americans who are covered by broadband access in some form, but just are not interested in accessing their non-regular subscribers to fixed or mobile broadband. So clearly we have a demand problem in Latin America. If you actually track growth in investment and network coverage and the growth in online population in Latin America, you see that those curves were growing steadily in parallel until about 5 or 6 years ago, when there was a decoupling between the continued growth in investment and coverage and slowdown in the growth of the online population. So we have a problem of demand in the region, which makes so much important to understand demand. Why are those 200 million Latin Americans not interested in broadband access? Is it cost? Is it skills? Is it interest? Is it content? All the issues that were raised in the previous panel and also in this panel. So demand side data is key to understand the magnitude of this challenge and to address this challenge in ways that are cost effective. And let me give you one example. I've been working with the Peruvian regulator OCIPTEL. OCIPTEL conducts an annual demand survey in the country, large-scale survey. And one of the questions asked is simply, why are you not connected? And the answer is actually quite surprising when you track over the years. Less and less people mention cost, and more people mention interest. But still, cost is a little bit above, is about 50%, whereas the interest is 40%. That's a general population. Now, when you control for other factors and you only look at respondents who have children at home, the cost spikes up about 25%. So this is what in the United States now is being called the homework gap. Those parents recognize that having broadband at home is essential for their children's education, and they just can't afford it. And on that basis, the regulators started thinking about a targeted voucher program for parents whose kids are in public schools to address that homework gap. So this is the kind of thinking, I think Manu mentioned this, thinking outside the box. This is a kind of thinking outside the box that having the demand side data would allow governments and everybody involved in this to start thinking about this outside the box. Where are we in Latin America? I think we make a lot of progress in terms of demand side data. Alexandre has been involved in in much of this and many levels, not only from Brazil, but at the regional and international level. But we still have many challenges, and I'll just mention a few. One of them is that we have some surveys that are conducted by National Statistics Office, very large scale, very serious surveys, but sometimes they're just one-off surveys. So they're done 1 year and then they're done whenever there's money available. They're not on the regular survey calendar of the National Statistics Office. We have a lot of inconsistency still about even basic things like who is considered an internet user. Is it 3 months? Have you used the internet in the last 3, 6, 12? Still inconsistency in surveys in Latin America about this very simple question. Data is not always publicly available, which is always an issue. And also, often there's poor visibility and poor coordination of this kind of surveys and the data. And this goes back to Allison's issue of is bad data better than good data? Now, the irony in Latin America is sometimes we have the good data, and yet the not so good data is the one that gets visibility. And here's an example. GSM study on gender gaps in mobile adoption. I really like GSMA, by the way. I respect their work enormously in the region. And they did a study that you may be familiar about the gender gaps in adoption. And they included Colombia and Mexico in their countries, were 11 countries. Each country, they sampled 1,000 people. 1,000 people. Imagine trying to estimate the gender gap in Mexico with a sample of 1,000. It's not possible. It just doesn't, the statistics just don't work. And yet you have a survey done by INEGI, the National Statistics Office in Mexico, which surveyed 75,000 households. So this is an example of one study. I mean, we have the good data. The data is there. It's just sometimes not as visible, and there's not the coordination that needs to happen between the National Statistics Office, the regulators, the policymakers, everybody involved in this to really take advantage of the data that is being produced. So in closing, I think in Latin America we have great examples of very good demand-side data. CETIC, where Alexandre works, is a great example because they not only address the demand-side data at the level of the household, they recognize that you also have to look at SMEs. You also look at schools. You also have to look at hospitals and all the broader digital ecosystem, as it is called. So we have good examples in Brazil. We have good examples in Mexico. We have good examples in many countries of the region, but yet many challenges, as said, that remains to be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Hernan. I was wondering if we have the required level of disaggregated data for policy-making decisions. This is an issue that we still have to address. In many surveys, we don't have the required level of disaggregated, like regional or by age, sex, etc. So, and also the inconsistency issue that we have to face. Although we do have internationally agreed frameworks, methodological frameworks, we still have some countries with different definitions for not only the internet users, but devices, for instance, the definition of computers, etc., activities, and so many other concepts. So thank you for addressing that. To keep balance, I will move to my right now, and I will give the floor to Mr. Mokhtar Yadley from the African Union Commission to give your perspective on the demand-side data production.
Thank you very much. Actually, I was thinking, will I speak last? And then I am surprised to not to speak the last one, because back home you say when you speak last, then you are the lovely one. And I was hoping that I will be the one. However, I think Alison has said everything he wanted to say. However, I want to underline one thing very important, that I am in a business of preparing and making policy happen. I am advising head of states on how to do policy, and any policy that should be very good, it should be evidence-based. It has to have data, otherwise it would be a very bad policy. And unfortunately, most of the time, we do bad policy because of lack of data. So data is very important. But data needs to be very reliable first. Data has to come on time. And data has to be appropriate in the sense it has to be tailored to the need and the specifics of that country. And I will cite 2 examples in my dealing with data and policy, and 3 paradoxes that are actually currently existing. The need of data that are actually well tailored is sometimes we assume that the techniques that are being used, the approach in conceiving, designing data is universal, scientific and universal, which is actually, to my view, not true. You cannot assume that any teacher in developing country who can afford himself to have a broadband home, you assume that any teacher in Africa can afford that. So from the purpose of forecasting, if you say that in Africa you have 1,000 teachers, and therefore those 1,000 teachers can afford themselves a 2 gigabit home, which is actually happening in developing countries, then you are wrong. Data are not really the same thing. You cannot assume that data provided by the World Bank and ITU that are actually 2 years back are the one appropriate for somebody who wanted to take something reliable to move tomorrow. And you cannot assume that collecting data is always something that is, how can I say, reliable, because when you start to collect data within a country, people who are providing data are seeing that data as analyzing their performance criteria. They will give you data from the government side because you think, okay, he's requesting data from me, and I don't want to show him that I'm doing my job very bad, so I give him the good data. And therefore, I don't get reliable data. But if ITU or World Bank ask them, they are not controlling me, then I can give them data. But in the same time, you have a paradox that people who can pay or afford for data to collect them can access to data, and those who cannot pay for them cannot access to them. And I did 2 examples. One of them I asked using the new technologies of GIS and surveys and so on, and I asked that people to provide me data. I didn't get anything. But I want to add to that, if you provide me data on time, you get an iPad. I get all data. That's most of the people do to get data that probably are not questionable at all. We need to know if data are really reliable, viable, can be used to really have a policy-based thing. The paradox number 3, when I came to collect data that are supposed to be very reliable, coming from the US or coming from the World Bank, and I came to my member state and see, okay, on cybersecurity, for instance, lately I was in a Peace and Security Council from the African Union, and I was advocating for cybersecurity matters, and I was providing example how cybersecurity is affecting the households. And the majority of my data are coming from the US. At the end, I'm told, okay, that's very good. Your data are coming from the US. I need data from Africa. Go and bring them to me. Without the data, then there is no policy. So this is where the mix of challenges and paradox and design are happening with regard to data. What we should do now? First of all, we need to empower those local people who are collecting the data. It's not data that are collected by somebody outside of the continent, be it in Africa or in Asia or anywhere else, who doesn't know the specifics and the interactions in the social context, that probably his data are the well-designed and good. Number two, the social measures, GIS, surveys, all technology combined together today can provide some very reliable data. Number three, governments need to take responsibility to enforce the fact that data need to be provided on time in a very reliable manner. So this is what I wanted to contribute with, and thank you again for giving me the floor.
Thank you, Mogata. You brought very important aspects. One is the timing that is needed to policymakers to have the data. If you take 2 years to produce the data, it is maybe in the technological field, it not be very helpful anymore. And also the accessibility in terms to have the data accessible to all stakeholders, especially to have access to the micro database to make a more in-depth analysis or to cross-tab data in different ways that usually when you have only the aggregated level data, this is not possible. So this is very important. Let me move now to Eleni Galpaya. You have the floor.
Right. Asia is not one Asia, and we have such a diverse set of stories on how data is used or not used in evidence-based policymaking. But let me address Rajan, which gives me my first talking point. You said you have so much data and you don't know what to do with it because there's so much personal data. We know this. We have historical anonymized call detail records from the telecom operators in Sri Lanka. We are not competing with the telecom operators. We are using it, coming back to SDGs, to identify where poor people live, to identify how cities are changing, because it's very fast changing from residential to commercial or mixed use areas, which national surveys cannot identify because they are done censuses every 10 years, household income expenditure surveys every 4 years. We are identifying where the poor people live, how much, and poverty mapping and poverty indices based on reload patterns. This is valuable socioeconomic data that is used and usable for policymaking. We advise the Western Megapolis Planning Project in Sri Lanka, our biggest development project funded by multiple funders, to look at where people live and where they travel to. This is useful to see where should we put bus routes in Colombo, in the western region of the country. That's really pro-poor use of your data for policymaking. It took us 2 years to negotiate this data as an independent think tank, and we had to sign non-disclosure agreements that would really put us in jail if we violate, if we put up a slide without the approval of the operators. This is a huge problem. Yet at the same time, operators in the region, without any conditions, give up their data to developed world universities and researchers and think tanks who come in and do analysis and publish papers which are absolutely wrong because they don't understand the context. So they will use 25% of the data and say, oh, this is what's happening in Bangladesh. When in fact, if you understand what that region is, it'll say, well, actually, that's completely wrong. So there's a huge problem in access to data by Southern researchers. And this is a real, real problem. That's my first point, but it can be done. Second, some of the data that has been most effectively used to change policies have come from really expensive household surveys, which, thanks to Canadian government or British government willing to fund it, we were lucky enough to be able to spend that kind of money across the region, 11 countries, to get national ICT, personal household level use data. They are no longer in this business, so funding is a real problem. When the Sri Lankan government introduced a really regressive tax on mobile phones, on the SIM card, a flat rate tax, 50 rupees a month or something, we had, thanks to household survey data, evidence to show that the mobile phone is not a luxury good. That's really stupid thinking. And that this tax would be a 25% cost increase on very poor people, because we could look at the base of the pyramid expenditures, which the supply side data cannot do, right? Because they actually don't know whether it's poor people or rich people who are spending this money. We were able to successfully roll back this tax. We now no longer can afford these types of data. When Myanmar, for example, is doing its planning, and some people are talking about the huge gender gap and how South Asia has a gender gap in mobile phone ownership and Southeast Asia doesn't, our national household survey showed that despite being in Southeast Asia, Myanmar has a nearly 30% gender gap in phone ownership. This comes from household data, which no supply-side data, even in a country with decent SIM registration rules, will give you, because SIM registration really doesn't work. You don't know which gender and so on. We also know that in Myanmar, from the surveys, that 66% of the population has a smartphone, and only 3% has a feature old phone. Why is this important? Because Myanmar is different to India. The interventions we plan in Myanmar should be based on very fancy mobile phones. We can do apps and funky things. It's not the solutions we should be recommending in India. These are the types of data that we get if we really study users. When we talk to women in Myanmar and we look at the nationally representative data, we know that women own less phones, as I said, but they make more calls and talk more. So there is no gender gap necessarily in access to phones, but there's a huge gender gap in internet usage. These are nuanced understandings of usage that you get only when you talk to users and in meaningful ways. The Indian decision to ban differential pricing was an example of a debate from developed countries on net neutrality coming into our part of the world, the regulator being unable to assess the evidence on the ground, that despite all the screaming and shouting, including by the civil society, that this was, in the short term, not a huge problem, and it was in fact helpful. That didn't mean we should have given a free pass to all types of differential pricing, but that we needed a more nuanced approach. So we have problems of access to data. We have regulators who are unable to assess a variety of data and make use of it in their decision making. We have a problem in funding of good research in our region.
Thank you very much, Eleni, for highlighting the challenges in having access to private data sources, especially in operators. 2 weeks ago, we had the ITU symposium on ICT and telecom indicators, and this was one issue that was raised, how to negotiate with private data sources. We have a lot of challenges like privacy and confidentiality. This is the main barriers preventing access, and of course commercial interests and costs, etc. And also thank you for highlighting the need of household surveys. Well, now we're going to move to our last speaker, Ms. Maria Elena Estavillo Flores from IFT in Mexico. Before giving the floor, Maria Elena, I would like to highlight that Professor Galperin has mentioned already, INEGI, the National Statistical Office here in Mexico, is one of the very good practices in the region. And in terms of collecting demand-side ICT statistics, Mexico has been providing surveys in regular basis, sometimes piggybacking on the national household, which, as Hernan has mentioned, about 70 or 80,000 households. It's a very large sample. So with such a large sample, it is possible to collect disaggregated data at various levels that is needed for policy. So I guess that we have a presentation. So Maria, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. It has been very interesting to hear all your interventions. And I'm going to talk now. Now, about what we are doing in the Federal Institute of Telecommunications, because when the institute was created, we found out that we had some very poor indicators. So we started to work on that. And since 2013, when we were created, we standardized all our indicators according to ITU definitions and best international practices. According to this standardization, carriers have had to make very big efforts to change all the reporting to the IFT, not without resistance, but finally they are working a lot to so that we now have more reliable information and that we have comparable information among the same carriers and with other countries that we didn't have before. So this is really a huge change for us. We have now also an electronic system to receive the data, to process it, so it is easier done for us and for the operators. And this centralized database is also available for public use, and this is also news on how we are working. As part of these changes, we now publish data by carrier. To do this, we had to have a new interpretation of what private information is and what public information is, because that was the reason why before we didn't have this division by carrier. Since these are public services, we are interpreting that these are public data and should be used publicly. Okay, I have some some of this data that we have been collecting to have an idea of what has been happening in Mexico. This is the change in household expenditure and mobile telecommunications related to income by different deciles. And we can see there how the average expenditure on deciles has been moving, have been declining, and mostly for the first deciles. We believe that this is coming from important reductions in prices. Yeah. This is, we're looking here at different bubbles that represent different cities in Mexico, different states in Mexico, and how we have so big differences in access and that are related to educational level, to income, and this is also related to the broadband subscription penetration. As you can see, the farthest to the right bubble is Mexico City, where we have very high levels of penetration, almost 90%. But then we go to the other side of the graphic and we see states like Oaxaca and Chiapas, which have very small penetration. So this is part of our challenges to make these bubbles get together. Yeah. This is the drop in telecommunications prices. This has been quite dramatic in the country. The deeper, greener part is the reduction in telecommunications prices. The other one is average prices. The other one, please. And here we see the difference in prices, in pricing, but among different telecommunications services, where most of the decline has been in mobile. The gray part is because we now don't have long distance calls, so it is 100%. But really, the most important reduction has been in mobile services, but we also have to look at the other services which have not had the same reductions. In fixed internet services, you can see how the subscriptions have been mounting. This is for fixed, but in the next one, mobile internet services, we have had a very big increment of subscriptions from 7% in 2011. Now we have a 54% of penetration. And now these are maps of coverage in mobile services for different technologies. And here we have a big challenge. This is 2G. Now you can see 3G in the next one, which is around the same coverage as 2G. But now we are looking at LTE in the next one. And well, this is where we have to work. We have now this new project, the shared network that has just been auctioned. This is a great project for our country, and we believe that this will help to improve this LTE coverage. In the last one, I wanted to talk a little bit about these efforts by INEGI that Alexander brought about. This has been an effort by INEGI, by ourselves in the IFT, and also by the Ministry of Communications. We are funding these efforts, the three institutions. Our background is that we had the ancient MODUTI, that's a module of the National Survey of Occupation and Employment that looked at telecommunications services. This functioned in a way that the interview was done to the person who opened the door, and often this person was not the ICT user, so the data was not very good. It had only nationwide statistics. Since 2015, this changed to have now the MODUTI became the ENDUTIH, and this means that the model is now an independent survey. The biggest methodological change was that now the interviews is done to the ICT user, and to all population, covering all population older than 6 years. And the objective is to know the availability and expenditure on computers, pay TV, fixed mobile telephony, and internet connections. The sample is now over 90,000 households, and we now have statistics for national level, but also for state level and for the biggest 32 cities in the country. This was for 2015. For this year, where the first results will come out in this month, in December, we will have an increase to 49 cities. That is data specific for these 49 cities. And next year, we will have rural and urban segmentation. So we're working a lot in these efforts to have better data in the supply side and the demand side. I would also say that in the IFT, we are conducting periodic surveys to consumers, not such as solid or wide as the INEGI, but these are also helping us to understand what the demand side is, its behavior. Thank you.
Thank you, Marilena. This is a very good example of cooperation between regulator and the National Statistics Office to come up with an important standalone, ICT standalone survey. In Brazil, we also have collaboration between regulator, NSO, and also CETIC, which is an independent data producers, to produce relevant statistics for policymakers. So now we have a few minutes for questions and comments from the audience. I would like to open the floor. If you have any comments, questions. Yes, please. Please say your name and organization.
Hello, my name is Carla Valverde. I come from the Ministry of Science, Technology, and Telecommunications of Costa Rica. First of all, it was a great workshop. Thank to everyone. I'm just going to make a comment, and I wanted to build on some of the arguments that have been already presented. And I wanted to return to the title of the workshop, that is Connecting the Unconnected. Where is the data? And I believe that the data sometimes is not inside our telecommunications sector. And I believe this because returning to the previous comments, if we want to connect the people, first we need to know if the unconnection is due to an affordability barrier, or a digital literacy barrier, or an infrastructure barrier. But if we go specifically to the affordability barrier, maybe we don't have the information. And I wanted to commend the case of Costa Rica, because in our National Telecommunications Development Plan, we have a program in which we try to address this affordability problem by giving the people a laptop and a subsidy, only to the families that live in a poverty situation. And this data is not in the policymaker and is not in the rector, but we do have it in the country, and it's part of the data of the Social Welfare Office. So what did we do? The ministry, as being in charge of the public policy, we defined the program, and then the rector is the one that, the regulator, is the one that takes care of implementing the program, but they don't have the data. So what we did is, as a government, we coordinated with the welfare office. So they identified the families which are in poverty, and they gave the ID number to the service providers. So if I'm a person, a member of a family that lives in poverty, I go to the service provider, I give my ID number, and they give me my laptop and my subsidy for paying for the internet. So the service provider doesn't have to ask me for my personal information or my economic situation, because the welfare office already went to the home of this family and they checked, and as the experts they are, they said, yes, this person lives in poverty and they do need a subsidy and a laptop. But we couldn't have done that if we went only to the information that is in the telecommunications sector, which is the one generated by the service providers, or the one that we'd have in the ministry from the users. We need specific data on poverty. So in the end, as a summary, I believe that it's very important to use all the data that we have as a country, and not always the one that is inside the telecommunications sector, or even in the one in the National Statistics Office. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other comments or questions? Yes, please.
Carlos Rey Moreno, University of the Western Cape in South Africa. I was surprised by the comment by Hernán Galperín in relation to the quality of the research done by the GSMA. With all the respect, I've been following up the outputs of the GSMA, at least in the South African and the African space, and when you talk to other internet service providers, when you talk to, it doesn't seem that it's as objective as it could be, and that is pushing the interest of a given set of providers in the continent, and not that much the public service of what science and evidence policy should be based upon. So I would like some clarification on that comment of saying that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will take one more question and then I will pass the floor. Who? You ask it? Yeah? Okay, go ahead. You have the floor. Please go ahead. You can go first.
Sorry, there was comments made on, I'm Claire from the GSMA, kind of connected with the comments made on our report. And I just sort of wanted to respond. I think our report, we were very also surprised by how much the particular report you mentioned was read. And I think it highlights that the huge lack of data on this issue. And that's why I think it has been absorbed by so many people. And I think it's also, I think there's a need for this to be collected by national statistics offices to do this. As Helani mentioned, there's an issue around cost. So we were limited in terms of numbers of surveys we could do because of budget issues. And I think it's not, I think this data needs to come from those who are doing national surveys so that others like us can focus our research budgets on answering some of the questions that are not answered. And then as this other small point on that is the modeling we did on the gender gap included also more than just the 1,000 surveys. But I think my point I wanted to make was just the sort of need to have this national level data funded collected by the National Statistics Office so the rest of us can focus on somewhere where those gaps are. And there's a real gap on gender data at national level.
Thank you very much. Erna, would like to make any comment?
Yes, thank you. I think the GSM representative responded well, and my comment was simply, when you have two studies trying to address the same question, and they have such different methodologies and sample sizes, it's inevitably you're going to try to compare them, and one has, the estimates that are coming from one will necessarily be better from the other. And again, I said this with my deepest respect for much of the work that GSMA does, and addressing the question, I think GSMA does a lot of its best work is on other issues, on many of the other issues that they work. And in this case, my sense is trying to fill gaps and trying to participate in a very interesting conversation about gender gaps in mobile adoption. So my point was highlighting that sometimes we have missed opportunities because and the situation is different. In some countries, the GSMA and other studies may be addressing information needs where simply no other data exists. So at least there is some reference point for the conversation. But in many other countries, and this includes most of Latin America, we've come a long way in terms of having solid statistics that can help us address and estimate what are the real gender gaps and many other gaps with very solid data.
Thank you. Mokhtar?
I would just want to highlight something, and it probably is not the purpose of our workshop. Yes, we have spoken about data for the purpose of making our forecasting, planning, and so on technicality. And there is a lot of challenges, specifically in Africa, specifically in collecting those data. But once we pass all that and we collect data, most of them do have some specific personal strategic data. And we need to think about how to protect those data. There is a lot of data that are being provided by citizens voluntarily in exchange of free services. And while those people think that they are clients or customers, they are becoming products. And those data may be used, abused, and misused. Not for the purpose of really, how can I say, I'm not talking about privacy per se. I'm talking about data being used for specific strategic cybersecurity matters that are not really in line of business imperatives. And that's something probably we need to think of and rethink the way we design data the way we conceive them, the way we collect them, and specifically the way we store them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other comments? Alison, please.
Thank you. I just wanted to return, I think the point was well taken about the fact that because ICT is increasingly cross-cutting, that it's no longer just a telecom sector thing. And I think the example Hilani was giving of big data being used, mobile data being used, big data being used for transport and planning and all that sort of thing is absolutely critical. And I think it has to be, as we try to deal with greater complexity, we of course talking about the need for this mobile data informing all sorts of other planning and stuff. But I did want to return to the impact of the available data that is there and how it is positively or negatively impacting on policy and development outcomes. Because I think in Latin America it's unusual that there's lots of good data. I think in many of our environments, if the IDRC funded ICT access and use surveys that we've been conducting in Asia and Africa and Latin America, but less so in Latin America, weren't done, when they were cut off, they stopped being done. I'm very happy to say that IDRC will be funding in 2017 limited household surveys again in Africa, 7 countries, Asia, 3 countries, and Latin America, 2 countries, which I think will begin to address this. Because I think, you know, the issues that have been raised around, you know, the wealthiest industry association probably in the world, receiving fundings from the big donors to go out and do non-representative studies and to, you know, determine development agendas is really problematic. You know, I think if we're going to be talking about collaboration and multi-stakeholderism, we need to say, well, who's paying for the data? What are they paying for it for? So I think it's absolutely fine for GSMA to say, we're doing gender studies overtly because our markets are saturated. The markets we can grow are where women aren't using things. And I think that's made quite openly. Nobody's pretending that that's not the agenda. But then to say, that is also the development agenda because there's no other data saying, oh, well, actually, the policy interventions are not around the descriptive statistics that are showing these inequities, but are actually around the fact that more women are concentrated in the bottom of the pyramid without education and income, and that's determining. So there's no ICT inequality as such. It's actually a social inequality that requires a much bigger intervention from government in terms of, you know, education strategies, keeping girls in school and all sorts of things, you know, not giving them pink cell phones or discounted packages or things like that. So I think these are you know, really important things to put on the table and actually say, you know, a lot of the advocacy groups, there's a lot of money. The big platforms do not give money to public research institutions, certainly not in the developing country. The money that goes from these big platforms goes to the big advocacy groups. So there's lots of money for advocacy, but there's not very much money for public interest research, public interest think tank, public universities, or NSOs. And so I think we really need to say who is paying for it, why is it being paid for, and what are the outcomes of this in terms of our development, you know, our policy agenda.
Thank you, Alison. Well, we are running out of time. I just would like to add to what Alison has said that transparency in the methodology and the methods is crucial to understand the quality of the data. I usually say that the methodology is the birth certificate of the data, so that you can understand the identity of the data. If you are transparent with the methodology, that's okay that we have a divergence in numbers and estimations. Well, I just would like to ask 30 seconds for each speaker, because Carla from Costa Rica has mentioned something very interesting. The data is not on the operators. So where's the data? So if you could please give a very brief and short answer. Where is the data? Let's start with Eleni and then Maktar.
I think some of the most valuable data is with the operators, so I disagree. We just aren't making maximum use of it. and the technology, the algorithms, and the capacities we have to analyze that data and really make use of it for development and socioeconomic purposes will only increase.
Thank you. Magda.
I will answer the other way. For sure, data is not within the government. That's for sure. Now, where is the data? My belief is everywhere, but the problem is not, there is no democratic access to data. That's the issue, I say. They are everywhere, and unfortunately, those who can't pay for them, to collect them or to store them, are the one who has data. So as Alison has said, we need to know exactly how the public and those policymakers who need the data for evidence-based policy need to know, or we need to set up how those can access to those data.
Thank you. Maria Elena, where is the data?
Yes, I believe that we have data everywhere. Because our challenge now is to have the capacities to process the data, to know where the data is, and also in parallel to assure privacy of personal data and awareness by the public who is sharing their data.
Thank you. Hernan?
It depends on your question. If you want to know something about those that are connected, the private operators know a lot. If you want to know something about the unconnected, they know nothing because they're not connected.
Yes.
So it really depends on what's your question.
Yeah, thank you. Rajan?
I think very emphatically, if you're talking about personal information and data, it's with the mobile operators, and it has to do with country specific. Your country may be very different. Please understand, in India, we only have one network. In most of the other countries, there are at least 5. You have a landline, you have a satellite, you have cable, you have private networks, government networks. In India, 1. So if you want it, you'll have to come to the mobile operators because that's where most of that information flows.
Thank you. Alison?
So I do think there's critical data, and we want it from mobile operators. But I think in a prepaid mobile environment particularly, there is a lot of data you cannot get simply from the big data or even the supply side data from operators. We have to, expensive how it is, we've got to go into the field and collect it. And I just want to make the final point, because I think a question of that is really, in our countries in Africa, there's very little data like the others. How do we find sustainable ways of getting this public data so that we're not biting our tongues at donor meetings because we actually want to make sure that we get the kind of funding that matches their agenda, or that we, aligning whatever we're doing with some other advocacy group just to get the data? How do we create good, public good statistics? And I really want us to think, as we are at the Internet Governance Forum, to think about emulating or get some commitment to the kind of model that we have at CETIC in Brazil, which is actually using the resources of the domain name registry, which I know is much bigger in Brazil than many of ours. But, hopefully in time we will actually get .Africa to Africa, and perhaps for those smaller countries that will never be able to afford the field work, we can actually get a fraction of that domain for public statistics.
Thank you very much, Alison. Well, I think that we may disagree in many aspects on answering where is the data, but I truly believe that we have a convergence idea that relevant demand-side data is crucial for policymaking decisions. And despite the growing debate on measurement and on statistics production on the ICT access and use, there is a lack, unfortunately, of systematic and reliable ICT statistics production, expressed, for instance, by the lack in several nations of data that can be used to measure the development of information society and to the universal access to broadband. So I think that we can leave this room with this idea that producing demand-side data is crucial for policymaking, despite of different views on where is the data. So with that, I would like to thank all of you that has attended this workshop. and give a round of applause for our speakers. Thank you very much.